when you have that type of cultural establishment trying to keep Conservatives down, you need someone like me who's not afraid of Doctor Who or whoever, and who's going to take the fight to them and not let them try and keep us down.
And you've also made these statements using inflammatory language that likens children and young people coming out as trans to the spread of a disease.
I do think that is very strongly linked to a lot of predators exploiting rules that are made for trans people to carry out activities that those rules should be nowhere near. We see it with men exposing themselves.
Anyway, the result was Kemi Badenoch, 53,806 votes, and Robert Jenrick, 41,388.
Welcome to the end of the world.
News just in. The Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain has a new leader. I repeat, the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain has a new leader. That's right. After a disastrous result in the 2024 general election, the great shite hope, Rishi Sunak, lost by default against sentient Hamshank and Tory in all but name Keir Starmer. So, with the other Tories now in power, what do the OGs, the original gentry, do? They elect a new leader, and this time it was a close race indeed. Dan, pull up the candidate list. So, competing for the leadership of the most evil political party this side of the Atlantic, we have some of the greatest minds on the island of Great Britain. The who's who of the hoi polloi, the best of the British bigots, to duke it out over who will take over this grey and unpleasant land when Keir Starmer inevitably gets turfed out by the very people he betrayed the Labour Party's base for. First up on the docket, the bookies' favourite, we had the child catcher, not to be confused with the milk snatcher, who was of course Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990, or the kid starver, who is of course our current Prime Minister.
You have failed me. Thank you.
Unfortunately for the child snatcher, however, he was attacked by his peers early in the competition for being too woke. Why was he just catching the children? Why wouldn't he burn them at the stake like a proper British patriot? What do you want children for? Was he some kind of queer? So, despite his early head start, he was the first to be knocked out. Second on the list was the People's Princess. No, not Diana, Baba Yaga. Now, Baba Yaga was a strong competition here, since she's famously also an anti-child candidate, and she had an evil hut with legs. So not only is she a landlord, but she can pull her entire house up by its bootstraps. But unfortunately for Baba Yaga, it turns out that the Tory party wasn't ready for an Eastern European witch to run the country, no matter how evil. So I might hear you ask, who could possibly be left here? Who is possibly evil enough to run the Conservative Party? The party that brought you the Bengal famine, for Christ's sake. Well, the final two candidates, after the more moderate Conservatives tried to rig the game to get James Cleverly into the final two against Robert Jenrick, and accidentally knocked Cleverly out via the worst tactical voting fuck-up in possibly party history. That part actually happened, by the way, proving Conservative MPs actually are as stupid as they look. The final round came down to Kemi Badenoch, a frothing-at-the-mouth transphobe who has so much hatred in her heart that she makes the child snatcher look like Father Christmas, and the moderate option, Lord Satan, King of Hell. Alas, it turns out that the Conservative Party wasn't ready for a moderate Tory to lead, so Satan lost the runoff and took his army of demons back to hell with him, leaving Kemi Badenoch the last demon standing. And as the new Tory leader, she promised to campaign tirelessly to cook the Smurfs into a stew, take back the One Ring from those pesky hobbits, and bring 1,000 years of darkness to the world. Makes you proud to be British. Now back to Dan, with the weather. Hello there. You're probably asking, what the fuck was that about? Well, I'll tell you. I'm Bridget Empire, science and culture correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, the only British newspaper that endorsed Lord Satan, the Tory leader, thank you very much. Not because we're moderates, God no, but because we have a blood pact with him that demands we print a newspaper every week, lest our souls be trapped in his measured and sensible lake of fire. You may be laughing now, but you won't when you get put through 1,000 years of means testing. With Kemi Badenoch leading the Conservatives though, that doesn't seem like such a bad option. Anyway, I'm here to introduce all of you to the new Tory leader, and why, as a British trans person, the prospect of her leading the Conservatives, and even standing a chance to lead the country, is fucking terrifying. You thought I was concerned about Wes Streeting as health secretary? Well, now the leader of the opposition is just as batshit as him on trans rights. So let's get the pleasantries out of the way and get straight into who the hell Kemi Badenoch even is, and why I'm currently shitting my pants.
You mentioned colleagues in the department. I've got to say that reports are that you're difficult to work with, that you had dreadful meetings, officials telling the Guardian newspaper that you were bullying, they were traumatised by your behaviour. How do you respond to this?
It's nonsense to say that it's the right that does culture wars. If you look at the debate between, on trans rights, it's trans rights activists and feminists. These are not conservatives. You look at the issues that happened at the school in Batley. It was very religious Muslims and a very pro-LGBT group. These are not conservative groups. These things are happening whether or not conservatives get involved. What I think is that it's only when conservatives come in with our common sense that we actually solve the problem, like we did on self-ID in Scotland, where everybody was squabbling and we had to step in and just say, no, we're not letting this into women's prisons. That's not culture wars, that's common sense.
Kemi Badenoch became a Member of Parliament in 2017 after having spent 2 years in the London Assembly, a seat she won by default after her predecessor quit, since she lost handily when she originally ran in 2012. After having proven herself a frothing-at-the-mouth bigot, she was parachuted into a Tory safe seat in Saffron Walden, essentially ensuring she'd become an MP, which is a cool and normal way to pick people who are supposed to represent constituencies on the local level. Among Kemi Badenoch's influences, she lists Thomas Sowell and Margaret Thatcher. So, that should worry you.
Children who need to be able to count and multiply are learning anti-racist mathematics, whatever that may be. Children who need to be able to express themselves in clear English are being taught political slogans. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
After being one of the few MPs to survive Boris Johnson's purge of anti-Brexit MPs in 2019, she was made Minister for Women and Equalities, the equalities part of which she has now removed, for reasons that will become increasingly obvious as this video goes along. In this capacity, she made it her duty to fill as many branches of government and its associated bodies with frothing-at-the-mouth transphobes. Like the last anti-trans MP I talked about on this channel, she played a massive part in creating the dangerously anti-trans culture war that currently makes the UK government the most openly and violently transphobic in Western Europe. Speaking of...
How many times have you seen J.K. Rowling personally in the last 2 years?
I saw her at Christmas. So
the famous lunch.
But I didn't. Yeah, that was another one. That was another. That was.
Okay.
We had our
so you've seen her a couple of times.
Easter, yeah, and we talk most days actually.
Some of you might remember that last month I made a video on Rosie Duffield, the most transphobic MP in the House of Commons, quitting the Labour Party. Well, a strong contender for most transphobic MP, and perhaps, if you want to ignore the fact that my title was kind of clickbait, the actual most transphobic MP in the House of Commons is actually Kemi Badenoch, and I'll get to why I think that in detail in a bit. But in short, she's a proud gender-critical feminist, said the NHS was hijacked by ideologues, and referred to trans care as harming children. She supports bathroom bans, both in individual businesses and in law in general, as well as banning trans people from changing rooms, shelters, and sports. Just in general sports. Just in case you thought she was doing all this because she was one of those transphobes that's been convinced she's fighting to protect lesbians or some other patronising bullshit, she abstained on same-sex marriage, has openly mocked gay marriage, plans to ban social transition in schools, and 3 queer advisors to her quit in protest of her bigotry, encouraging her to leave as she was unfit for her job. And she wants to exempt trans people from any conversion therapy ban, which would, because of the way conversion therapy works, not ban conversion therapy. She's also a notorious bully. According to former staff and co-workers, said that maternity pay is excessive and has gone too far, and she hacked Labour MP Harriet Harman's website, who at the time was deputy leader of the Labour Party, which is a crime, but something everyone has just decided to forget, even laughing about it on TV, like that's just normal. She's called for 5 to 10% of all civil servants to be sent to prison. People who've worked for her have called her out for bullying and traumatising behaviour, and just to put the cherry on top of this shit cake with puke frosting, she likened trans people to a disease in Parliament and faced 0 consequences for it. In fact, she's now got promoted for it. Obviously, comparing minority groups to diseases is less than ideal, but if you want to get into, like, history, it's a hallmark of fascism. From Rwanda to Germany, calling minorities a virus or comparing them to insects is the kind of language you hear in the build-up to massive violence. So, in short, Jesus fucking Christ, oh my God, fuck off. This is the worst possible Conservative leader for any prospect of a future for trans people in the UK. And that's strong fucking competition. If she lasts. And I'll pick up on that thread later.
The Conservative Party.
Send their regards.
So, how did she get here? Well, despite former employees calling working for her so traumatising they felt they had no other choice but to leave, after the moderates in the Conservative Party tactically voted themselves into their preferred candidate not making the final two contenders for the Tory leadership, a position, by the way, Badenoch has now run for multiple times, making headlines the last time for blasting all other candidates for not hating trans people enough, particularly Penny Mordaunt, who was the only candidate that didn't actively want to throw us all off a cliff, and who she pushed into being transphobic on the campaign trail to compete. In a race between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, two of the most batshit people in the history of British politics, and again, this is the country that brought you the Bengal famine, she was largely seen as the least awful out of two of the most awful people possible, even for the Tories. Despite however she might want to make herself out to be a candidate who can unite an eternally divided Conservative Party, she was the first choice of only 35% of Tory MPs, so she's not exactly popular even in the party she's supposed to be leading. And even in the final two runoff, where the vote goes from MPs to the Tory membership, very democratic system, she won 57% of the vote. So the Tories aren't exactly speaking with one voice right now. She is, rightly, seen as too obsessed with hating on trans people, too obsessed with culture wars, and with no direction on any of the issues that most people care about in the country. And that's according to the Tories. According to the general public, well, forget about it. John Harris for The Guardian, in his article about her rise into the leadership, described her as a zealous culture warrior, Brexiter, and self-styled net zero skeptic, which is an accurate description, if treating her lightly. Although he used that to contrast her with the current leadership of the Labour Party, which is consistently attacking trans rights, doing austerity, committed to maintaining Brexit, and which abandoned its climate change pledges to sink a bunch of money into carbon capture instead. So, as much as I'd like things to be different, is this not a classic case of these parties being two cheeks of the same conservative draconian arse? Even on the issues The Guardian chooses to highlight? Like a month ago, Keir Starmer wrote an article for The Sun headlined, "I will not sacrifice great British industry to the drum-banging, finger-wagging net zero extremists," which sounds indistinguishable from the kind of stuff Badenoch has been saying on the climate crisis. And while no one is as actively hostile to trans people as Kemi Badenoch, Wes Streeting, the current health secretary under Starmer, is arguably just as bad as she will be. Only a couple of weeks ago at the time of writing, he met with an anti-trans, anti-abortion hate group and apparently promised to maybe do a bathroom ban. He's kept Badenoch's CAS review-backed ban on trans healthcare for under 18s, constantly praises that aforementioned CAS review, and goes on right-wing shows all the time to talk about how much he hates us. Unfortunately, I think with Kemi Badenoch and Wes Streeting at the very top, they're going to encourage each other to go further and further in their aggression towards trans people. In my opinion, Kemi Badenoch and Wes Streeting together are the worst case scenario for trans people in the UK right now, though things can always get worse.
I hope you enjoy a few pints with the lads tonight. Up the rah!
Wes Streeting, however, won his seat by only a few hundred votes, and Kemi Badenoch is 2 bad moves away from a palace coup due to a lack of popularity. So, don't panic yet. There's still hope. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, as always. And apparently she's not exactly competent, so maybe she'll fuck it all up before she can get far enough to do too much damage. According to a former Conservative minister talking to The Guardian, when she was at trade, Kemi really wasn't interested in huge areas of trade, because she regarded herself as the guiding mind over and above everything, rather than being bothered with the detail. If we talked to her ex-ministers, quite a lot of them would say they'd go to meetings with her, and it was obvious she hadn't read the brief. That's not a great precedent. You've got to show up. If when you do show up, it's to pick a fight, that doesn't seem ideal. You can bore voters into voting for you like Keir Starmer and John Major did. You can charm them like Tony Blair and, to some extent, Boris Johnson did. But you can't argue them into voting for you. So policy-wise, and politically, she's a very difficult choice to understand the party making. With what she said about maternity leave, she has damaged the political prospects of lots and lots of candidates up and down the country in the general election. And according to a Tory special advisor, Kemi Badenoch wasn't loved in the Department for Business and Trade. She didn't want to be there, and they could tell. She cornered Rishi Sunak at the Cabinet Away Day after a machinery of government change because she didn't want business added to her portfolio. It was more work and 2 whole bills. She wouldn't take boxers home during recess and was often uncontactable on weekends. She would block right rounds without grounds to do so, other than that she disagreed ideologically. She's divisive, lazy and antagonistic. All that being said, so long as she can turn her eye on Starmer and not sow more division within the ranks, she might be okay, as she is smart at least. A vote of confidence there. Clearly, she is loved in the party, and not a disaster waiting to happen, whose Liz trust levels are batshit.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
In lighter news, Kemi Badenoch is absolutely massively out of touch with the British public. She famously spent most of her campaign for the Tory leadership attacking beloved Scottish actor David Tennant, who is a trans child, and is therefore rightly not very happy with the amount of crap she's been doing to make his child's life hell. She actually used this issue to launch her campaign, opening her first campaign video with a clip of David Tennant and proudly telling the great British public that she's not afraid of Doctor Who. I'm not sure if the optics of presenting yourself as someone with the same priorities as the Daleks is the best campaign strategy, but it did manage to get her the top job in the Conservative Party, which is, to be fair, like being awarded the title of worst smelling turd. Yes, it's technically a win, but winning it just means more people know you're a piece of shit.
Until we wake up and Kemi Badenoch doesn't exist anymore, I don't wish ill of her, I just wish her to shut up.
No, I will not shut up. When you have that type of cultural establishment trying to keep Conservatives down, you need someone like me who's not afraid of Doctor Who or whoever.
You would make a good Botanic.
To be fair, she's on the same page as arch-transphobe J.K. Rowling on that, who's had a grudge against David Tennant since he vetoed her appearing in an episode of Doctor Who, and in a move that makes her look very cool and very normal, said that David Tennant was the gender Taliban. Speaking of Jimmy Kimmel Rowling, you would think that since J.K. Rowling paints herself as a liberal if not a socialist, despite supporting fascists like Posey Parker and Matt Walsh, and more recently Donald fucking Trump, and paints herself as a feminist despite supporting abusers like Marilyn Manson, that she would be aghast at a Tory leader just in general, but especially a Tory leader who rallies against maternity pay, had a bunch of her queer staffers quit due to bigotry, and works with 55 Tufton Street and its hard-right anti-abortion, anti-women's rights agenda. Instead, she has praised Badenoch's brains and bravery and called her a women's rights leader, which is like calling Margaret Thatcher a workers' rights leader. And by that I mean she's not. In the words of this fake news parallel universe rag, the Daily Telegraph, or as we call it in my reality, the Torygraph. J.K. Rowling has praised Kemi Badenoch's brains and bravery in standing up for women's rights after she was unveiled as the new Tory leader. The Harry Potter author and Mrs. Badenoch have both vocally opposed gender ideology, with the latter insisting during her leadership campaign that a child cannot be trans. Not for nothing, everyone, but I am trans, and I was a child with these exact feelings. I didn't burst out of the ground at 18 fully formed like an Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings. Having access to puberty blockers before I was forced through a puberty that made me want to end it all would have saved me decades of suffering. Responding to a suggestion that she would be mad about the result, Miss Rowling said on Twitter, "On the contrary, I'm delighted a woman who'll stand up for sex-based rights is now leading the opposition. My thoughts and prayers are with David Tennant at this trying time." As you can see, these are two people whose every impulse is completely tapped into reality and aren't at all part of a weirdo internet cult that's indecipherable to anyone who doesn't have cornflakes for brains. As a reminder, Kemi Badenoch thinks maternity pay has gone too far. She blocked trials for supporting workers through menopause and voted against measures to limit harassment of women seeking abortion. So, not quite the women's rights hero Rowling would have us believe. And obviously, because when Rowling said women's rights advocate, she means wants trans people to be sent to the gender gulag. And if you're still in doubt that she's actively bad for the women of the UK, she said when asked about her opposition to maternity pay, "We need to have more personal responsibility. There was a time when there wasn't any maternity pay and people were having more babies." Yikes, okay Shinzo Abe. She has since tried to backtrack on this position once she realised that everyone who isn't stuck in her head thinks this is absolutely ridiculous, but we know what she said. And Kemi Badenoch's extreme positions are too much for even some of the most fringe figures in her own party. Nadine Dorries, former Tory MP, for example, spent much of her book, The Plot, talking about Kemi Badenoch, accusing her of being backed by bigwigs in the party and the people that back the party, who are apparently, contrary to the wishes of most of the Tories, surprising to me, are completely obsessed with attacking trans people and very little else. Presumably Dorries doesn't have a problem with her rampant transphobia, so much as she has a problem with the fact that Badenoch has had her career propelled towards the top of the party by the same faction that deposed Boris, the big dog, Johnson, who Nadine Dorries spent most of her final few years in office doing everything but making out with sloppy style in public. Badenoch fell out with journalist Nadine White after the journalist investigated claims that Badenoch had refused to participate in a video promoting the COVID-19 vaccine in black communities. Now, this might make it sound like Kemi Badenoch is anti-vax, but I don't actually think that, because it's much more likely that this is just her anti-blackness showing. And she is vehemently anti-black. Kemi Badenoch is just a black white supremacist, straight up. And if you doubt that, know that this isn't just my opinion, because she's actually one of the faces behind one of the most straight-up anti-black government reports of the post-war era. A document that moulded the later anti-trans Bible, the Cass Review, which Badenoch champions to this day and had a huge hand in. I'm talking, of course, about the Sewell Report, a report made in response to the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, and in response to previous reports on systemic racism that gave real and tangible recommendations on how to tackle systemic racism. The Sewell Report acts as a no-you from the government, denying that anything needs to change, and worse than that, claiming that institutional racism does not exist. This was Kemi Badenoch's gift to the UK.
Now a review set up by the British government claims the UK no longer has institutional racism.
Kemi Badenoch was Women and Equalities Minister during the time of this report, so this was her brief. She was the one in charge of its production, the deadlines, and how to respond to this absolute shit show that was basically made to prevent the government from having to implement any of the recommendations of the Lammy Report, the last report on systemic racism that outlined a bunch of practical steps that would actually make the UK a more equitable place for black people and other ethnic minorities.
I didn't expect to find that the figures for young offenders were quite as bad as they are. I mean, if 41% of our youth prison population is from a black ethnic or minority ethnic background, that's heading to half of our prison estate.
But of course, the Tories don't want to do that, because that would involve them actually having to do governing. The government's response to the Sewell Report, titled Inclusive Britain, was slammed for, as you might imagine, politically charged language. Kemi Badenoch wrote the foreword, telling people that the report was telling people the truth, despite it obviously not, and quoting Thomas Sowell to do so. The report was not well received. The Runnymede Trust called it frankly disturbing. The University and College Union called it an insult to all those in Britain who experience racism. The UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent called it an attempt to normalise white supremacy. And historians listed in the report as stakeholders were reportedly outraged to be attached to such a shameful document. So yes, she is a white supremacist. Badenoch also pushed back against the fact that systemic injustice led to more ethnic minorities suffering from COVID-19 in England, when opposition MPs such as the GOAT, Zara Sultana, was grilling the government on the disproportionate suffering of, for example, the black British community under COVID. Kemi Badenoch replied, "This is one of the best countries in the world to be a black person," which I'm sure was of great comfort to black Britons with COVID. Kemi Badenoch's legacy, everyone. Dying on the hill of white supremacy to further her own career in one of the most frothing at the mouth racist parties in the country. And given the competition, that's saying something. And Kemi Badenoch, more than anything else, hates trans people. It's most of what she talks about, which, as a trans person, sucks ass. Most of her efforts behind the scenes in government were apparently in the service of filling supposedly independent bodies like the Equality and Human Rights Commission with rabid transphobes, something she proudly bragged about when she was celebrating the Cass Review, her pride and joy, a document I made a big video about a few months ago, but basically is a playbook for legitimising discrimination against trans people by the government and the NHS. Very cool! In Kemi Badenoch's own words, on Twitter, in response to American transphobe Abigail Schreier telling Bill Maher, another American transphobe, that Britain succeeded in banning puberty blockers for 2 reasons, namely a centralised NHS and J.K. Rowling. The third reason was having gender-critical men and women in UK government, holding the positions that mattered most in equalities and health. You only need to look at what the SNP did in Scotland to see what would have happened had we not intervened. The Cass Review would never have been commissioned under a Labour government. Labour didn't want to know. We get incredible opposition from the system on everything. It was when the ministers changed that everything changed. In normal and functioning countries, admitting this would probably get you put on trial. But in this country, you can do whatever the fuck you want as long as it makes life worse for trans people or other minorities. So, the Cass review was a stitch-up by a party committed to making life worse for trans people. And Kemi Badenoch is very proud to have fucked with every part of government and supposedly independent bodies that she needed to make sure trans people suffer as much as possible, no matter how much it destroys trust in the system or, fills every branch of government with sycophants and people that only care about one issue that won't solve any actual material problems for people who need help. Very cool, very unbiased. And it's not just in her professional life that she makes targeting trans people her priority. Leaked audio obtained by Vice News revealed in 2021 that she privately mocks LGBT rights, questions same-sex marriage, and calls trans women men. What a cool and measured individual. I'm sure the Tory party will only become even more normal from this point on. In her own words, when the cameras weren't rolling, "It's no longer about minority rights in terms of race anymore or nationality," Badenoch says in the recording. "It's now, it's not even about sexuality now. It's now like the whole transgender movement where, okay, we've got gay marriage and civil partnerships, so what are transsexuals looking for?" Even when, so people hear about, like the whole bathroom thing. It's actually more of an American thing, but they have a similar problem that right now, so it's not just about being free to marry who you want. You now want to have men using women's bathrooms. At the time, Labour condemned these comments. Now, Wes Streeting goes on Talk TV and says shit like this all the time. And Starmer just supports him on it, because the right of the Labour Party would replace him with Streeting at the drop of a hat if he got half a percentile less hateful for even a second. I hate this country. Speaking of hating this country, Kemi Badenoch spearheaded one of the key Tory policies that was roundly defeated this year when they lost the general election to Labour. Guess what? It's a bathroom bill. You know those things a bunch of American states tried throughout the last decade, only to find that they are unenforceable and massively unpopular? Well, the people making these laws don't care if they work, or if people want them. They want trans people to feel unsafe going out in public. And the person most gung-ho for these policies in the UK is our new Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch. From June this year in The Guardian. Kemi Badenoch has said the Conservatives will change the Equality Act to rewrite the definition of sex and allow organisations to bar transgender women from single-sex spaces, including hospital wards and sports vets. The party will make clear that the protected characteristics of sex means biological sex, enabling those who wish to bar male-bodied people from organisations or activities to do so. Badenoch said it would provide reassurance for services such as those aimed at domestic abuse victims. Whether it is housed in women's prisons, or instances of men playing women's sports where they have an unfair advantage, it is clear that public authorities and regulatory bodies are confused about what the law says on sex and gender and when to act, often for fear of being accused of transphobia or not being inclusive, Badenoch said. That is why we are today pledging that, if we form a government after the election, we will clarify that sex in the law means biological sex, and not new redefined meanings of the word. The protection of women and girls' spaces is too important to allow the confusion to continue. Now, amending the Equality Act is bananas. And so, given how fucked British politics are, something the Labour Party has been arguing over, since it is also split between rabid transphobes and people that don't give a shit. But unlike the Tories, they also have like 5 people in the party that are pro-trans, but not pro-trans enough to speak out when Streeting is calling for us all to be put in wheelie bins and dumped in a landfill. Nevertheless, the Tories campaigned on this issue, masterminded by Kemi Badenoch, and in that campaign lost in a landslide. But don't believe for a second that this means this policy won't be making a comeback. Kemi Badenoch is not a practical politician. She's an ideologue, and her ideology has nothing to do with what she thinks will help the country. It is an ideology built on hatred. And when this bathroom bill returns, as long as Wes Streeting is Health Secretary, I don't trust the Labour Party to oppose it. In fact, they might try and poach it before she can put it forward. At this point, I'm just hoping someone in the Tory party decides it's 2 o'clock before they destroy what little remains of their reputation and make way for Prime Minister Nigel Farage to do everything Oswald Mosley wanted and more. I don't exactly think Badenoch would mind that though. She happily works with hate groups all the time. She'd probably defect to a triumphant Reform Party and just take the mask even more off. Actually, I'm not sure how that's possible. She might as well be an open fascist. She has all the same opinions and policy ideas as one. Why not just come out and say it at this point? I mean, she met with the hate group LGBT Alliance back in 2020 and clearly knew they were a hate group, since they were meeting to discuss basically making a Section 28 for trans people. Their shared hatred was the point of this meeting. And she's pissing a bunch of other countries off too to do this kind of shit. In March, she decided the UK would no longer recognise the legal gender of trans people from Australia, Canada, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Finland, Greece, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, Moldova, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, Russia, Serbia, Singapore, Slovenia, Spain, Switzerland and Uruguay and half of the USA, among other countries, which is impractical, hard to enforce, will piss off these respective countries, well, probably not Russia, but the rest of them, and is just plain hateful. According to Lee Hurley for Trans Rights, Badenoch claims it is to stop abuse of the process, an unevidenced claim to try and hide the fact she is targeting places with self-ID, as she doesn't like self-ID because she's a bigot. Indeed, if the UK accepts self-ID changes from other countries, how can they argue it's harmful for UK trans people to self-ID? So, if you're not as draconian and cruel in the way you gatekeep trans people from receiving legal recognition as the UK, you're on Kemi Badenoch's shit list. As if the UK is the gold standard for understanding trans people, instead of being notoriously awful and bigoted. The United States calls us TERF Island, for God's sake. Do you know how bad you have to have fucked it to be famously worse for queer people than the United States? Pretty fucking bad. They just elected Trump for a second fucking term.
Heavy into the transgender world, heavy into lots of different worlds.
Kemi Badenoch also said on Talk TV that she wanted to give J.K. Rowling a peerage, putting her in the House of Lords, making the most famous bigot in the Isles an unelected legislator for life. Something Rowling has apparently said she's turned down multiple times after Badenoch revealed she lived in a parallel universe where Rowling and Hilary Cass, two of the people, along with Badenoch, who have done the most to ruin trans people's lives in the UK, need protection and are attacked relentlessly by all sorts of oddballs and bad people, which just further convinces me that we don't live on the same planet as these people. People talk about the left being stuck in social media bubbles, but how else do you explain this sort of talk without acknowledging the fact that most people don't give a shit about trans people, and that all of this obsession with taking us down is the business of an insular group of fanatics hyping each other up on social media? Like, I've read a bunch of the Cass review. It's bad science, it's bad policy, and it's entirely lacking in any kind of worth besides legitimising the pre-existing hatred for trans people in the UK's political class. Badenoch, however, in her own words, managed to get Cass a peerage, and called the now infamous paediatrician a strong voice for women who have fought for so much and need protection. When Cass was sworn into the House of Lords, in one of the most overt displays of how the British state has internalised anti-trans hatred, just draping the person who's doomed us to at least several years of institutionalised discrimination in a fucking cape and gold shit, and getting the fucking king to whack a sword on her and tell her that she's in there for life, for what? Kemi Badenoch said, "Those who told the truth about the damage extreme gender ideology was causing children are some of the bravest I've ever met." I know fuck the Tories isn't exactly a new sentiment on this channel or just anywhere, but fuck the Tories and fuck Kemi Badenoch. You know, for some reason, even though I've lived through the last 20 years of everything getting worse and worse forever and ever, I'm always surprised at how much worse things can get. Kemi Badenoch as Tory leader is absolutely worst case scenario shit. And if Wes Streeting continues to get his way in the Labour Party, or God forbid, becomes Labour leader, as the Labour right have been pushing for the last 5 years or so, we are locked into a Britain that only makes laws in order to ruin the lives of trans people and do austerity. At this point, my hope is in how unpopular Wes Streeting is with the public and his own constituency, and how unpopular Kemi Badenoch is in the Tory party. Tory MPs are not happy with her as leader already, and it's not been very long. And if we've learned anything from having 5 Tory leaders in 5 years, it's that there's nothing the Conservatives love more than stabbing their leaders in the back. And given there are 5 years until the next general election, unless something drastic happens, there's plenty of time for the majority of the Tory party who didn't want her to regroup and put someone else in their place. The last Tory leader to stay the leader for 5 years was David Cameron. After a decade of instability, I highly doubt that Kemi Badenoch is the figure that will end the infighting in the Tory party and stave off the classic Conservative instinct to coup the moment you start to look even slightly bad. And given that pretty much every party in the UK thinks Badenoch's leadership is a win for them, that might not take as long as you think. So, my message for Kemi Badenoch is this. Don't beware the Ides of March. Everything is fine. Walk into the Senate. Just let it happen. Please. Oh, Brutus, don't worry about him. He's just here for moral support. Please, just do this for me. I would really like to feel safe in my home country again. And for the rest of you, thanks for watching.
Kemi Badenoch. Kemi Badenoch.
Kemi Badenoch has...
Kemi Badenoch.
Hey! Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you liked this video, even if you didn't, why not give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share it with all of your friends, leave it running in the background and send me money, at least several £1,000,000, because I would like to not be poor and I've got a big overdraft. Would you like to help me get out of it? Well, send me money on Coffee or PayPal, links below, as always, for one-time donations, or better yet, if you sign up to my Patreon or my YouTube memberships, you can get early videos, access to the members-only Discord, my Nintendo friend code, and exclusive content, and get your name, that was very loud, sorry, get your name right out at the end of each video, just like these lovely people. Quesadilla de Tortilla Azul, Liron, Adam Lees, Danielle Nevels, no, not that Paul, MB, Madeline Guire, Ben Murphy, Lex Phoenix, Ender Kruzitz, Janelle, Miradi, Jade Senior, Boa Ear, James W, Marva and Or, Tamsin Bob, The Builder, 5445554, Deborah Laboon, Vegas, Zillas Athenium, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Unchained, Sarah Jason, Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena Real, Sierra Whiskey, Orestria, Ali Catkill, John N, Scully, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Daden, Robin Podolsky, Turtle, Chooms, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabroga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandria Lilly, Howard Lott, Neredy Scudger, and Joey Cobalt. Thank you for your patronage, and may we escape this hell. Ugh. Goodbye. This is why you use sound effects for the news alarm.